In the detail of one flying snowflake, is there a blueprint for the storm? Can the choices of one cold statistic overthrow the power of the phone? Have we yet to realize that the world we walk is round? Can we find dimension in direction still unfound? Is every revolution a move to higher ground? Show me
Here.
And if I can just note that Councilmember Barry is due a little later this evening, and Councilmember Robinson is on a fact-finding mission for the council in California. We contributed 2 cents toward his trip. Yeah. Are there any council comments? Councilmember Clay.
Well, happy Chinese New Year to everybody. I had my Chinese New Year dinner before I came, which is why I'm a tiny bit late. It was very good. So a couple of things I wanted to say. The first one is to remind everybody that our new president issued a call to service and asked everybody to volunteer in their communities on Martin Luther King Day, which is our National Day of Service. But I also wanted to ask people to think about continuing their volunteer service throughout the year. I'm reading the statistics about the number of jobs lost, the number of people applying for aid to food banks and other resources, and asking people to think about contributing, in particular contributing food to the food banks and volunteer resources to nonprofit organizations. The second item that I wanted to note is that there's been a slew of activities related to vandalism of vehicles, and some of that occurred in my ward, and I want to remind people to lock their vehicles at night. There's been a few reports in the last couple of weeks of people whose cars have been rifled through and their cars have been unlocked, and remind people to lock their vehicles at night. The last thing I do before I go to bed is check all my doors, and one more time for good measure, hit the auto locks on my car to make sure my car is locked, because I also frequently go out in the morning and find that I've forgotten to lock my car. So I've started that habit now of when I lock my door at night, I hit the auto locks on my car keys. So I think that's a good thing for folks to do. And I also replaced my broken front porch light yesterday evening at about 6 o'clock at night, and I now have a nice new bright porch light, which I also encourage people to turn on their porch lights at night. It actually it helps deter criminals. After my car got broken into, I think 3 times on Elm Avenue, and the police officer came out and said, you know, you really ought to leave your porch light on. Since I've left my porch light on, my car has not gotten broken into in front of my house or in my driveway. I don't know that there's necessarily direct correlation, but it's another reminder that I wanted to put out to people to be safe and lock your cars and turn on your porch lights.
Councilmember Wright?
Thank you. I have sort of comments and questions, really a question for the city manager, and it has to do with parking tickets and the enforcement of our parking ticket, our parking permit rules. And I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the 2 times that tickets have, the enforcement has been most rigorous in my neighborhood were one time right on July 1st, which is the day after the permits expire. And a lot of tickets were given out to people, many of whom had permits but hadn't renewed them, an oversight. And then the second was on Inauguration Day recently. And I just want to make sure that we're not using those as opportunities just for revenue generation, but we're really focused on what the original purpose of the permitting is for, which is to prevent people from mainly parking at the metro, parking for the metro and walking to the metro, or college students around Montgomery College, and to preserve day in and day out opportunities for the residents to park in the street. And that, to do that, we really need to be focused on relatively consistent enforcement throughout the year, and just want to make sure we don't have any approach where we're planning to or trying to gain revenue from the permit system just for the sake of gaining revenue.
No, I can say unequivocally, Councilmember Wright, that we do not enforce for revenue generation purposes. The only discussions, in fact, that the chief and I even have about revenues from parking is when we're essentially establishing our revenue projections for the coming fiscal year budget. We will consult with the chief based on kind of what we've brought in year to date, and then look at staffing patterns, things of that nature. We will touch base on the same level mid-year when we're doing our current year projections, but other than that, quite frankly, the chief and I never even talk about revenues coming from parking enforcement, and truthfully, there's no incentive for the police department to enforce for that reason because the money does not go back to their budget. So there's really a total separation of what the police department's activities are and the role that the finance director and I play in terms of looking at the budget and doing revenue projections.
Okay, well, I'm glad, encouraged by that, and thank you for those comments. I didn't want people in the community or myself to jump to conclusions based on those 2 data points. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Next item is noting additional agenda items and the agenda scheduling update. One agenda item for tonight is that our first item on the agenda, the legislative briefing, is going to be postponed because the main presenter for that item had a death in the family, and she couldn't be here this evening, so we're going to try and reschedule that for next week. And in terms of agenda scheduling, I don't think there's too much else to report beyond what I did last week, that next week we'll have the report from the Health Services Impact Committee and also discussion of Council Grants Program. The following Monday, February 9th, we'll have our strategic plan and priorities discussion. And then I would note that on the following week, the Monday, February 16th, the city will be closed for the President's Day holiday, so that our meeting that week will be Tuesday, February 17th, at which point we will have public hearings on both the Ritchie Avenue speed hump petitions and the Pinecrest traffic calming project. So our next item on the agenda is public comment period, and if anybody would like to make any comments, please come to the microphone and identify yourself, and please keep your comments to 3 minutes.
Hello. I don't know the protocol. I'm Brian Beach. I live on the Ethan Allen Avenue. I'm in your district. And it was my property that I don't know if you've all heard of, had a fire. They burned down a bunch of fences adjacent to Forest Park. And spoke to the police, spoke to the fire department, and they say it may or may not be like with the rash of like tire slashings and whatnot. But it seems to be have escalated from just like simple vandalism. It was pretty far away from my house because my property runs the length of Prince George Avenue. So, but it was pretty close to a couple houses there. And if the fire department wasn't called when they were, it could have been pretty significant. So I've had a history of, because basically there's a fence that the city put up from Forest Park that separates it from the adjacent property, where it's a kind of a common area. And my fence is a stockade, and it butts up to the chain link. And I've been repairing it. I've been there 6 years off and on because people keep kicking holes in it or just trying to get access to this common area. And it wasn't really that big a deal until now. And so I think maybe something addressing the access to the common area from the park needs to be looked into. My insurance is going to cover me replacing the stockade. I don't know if maybe in conjunction with the city, or we can do something to make it more secure. But I just wanted to raise the concern. So,
if I can just ask you, I want to make sure that my memory is correct, that the city put up a fence that closed off access to the woods back there?
yes.
And so the other fences adjoin that one?
Yeah, if this is the park, this is the fence, this is the common area, and my property runs adjacent to it, and I had a stockade fence that butted up to the chain link.
So what people are trying to do is get in kind of where the two fences meet?
Yes, but now my fence is, like, I lost about 200 feet of fence, which,
To the fire?
to the fire, yeah, due to the fire. Before they had just been kicking holes in it, and I've been, patching it as I went. And now I got Long Fence coming out tomorrow to come give me an estimate. But it seems like it's gone from. I mean, if it was just kids playing around, it would have been one thing. Probably maybe lost a couple sections, but it's very significant. 200 feet. So. And I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, and it wasn't just at that one point. It was this about 50 feet this way, 50 feet this way, and then 50 feet up. So it was, I mean, obviously, they did a little bit more than just they're playing around. So.
Right. I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, well, things happen. But I appreciate it.
Does the chief just want to make any comments in terms of the anything that the police department has turned up in terms of any of this?
Well, the investigation, because it's arson, is being conducted by the fire department. We went back and reviewed the tape as a result of some earlier communications I had with you and the city manager earlier this morning. We got no calls on any activity that occurred Friday night or Thursday night when we had the other individuals that obviously walked through the streets for, I would think, several hours doing what they did in the 20 vandalisms now that occurred, and then we had 4 vandalisms Friday night. I have one detective who's working all 24 of them and has interviewed, I think at this point, all 20 of the victims from the first one, and we're interviewing, they were out in the neighborhood again today to interview the second 4. I don't have a nexus between the fire and the vandalisms at this point. We will obviously talk to the fire department once they get an investigator assigned. Has an investigator talked to you from the fire department?
No, I do have the incident number. I know fire marshal will look at it, but they haven't spoken.
Okay. It goes again to, once again, which I've encouraged, and Colleen, you brought up again, we need people to call. I mean, it's hard to believe that they walked through the community and 24 cars were vandalized. Now, the only thing I can say in the thing we put out as an advisory this afternoon, hopefully everyone saw it to follow it up, that the cars that were hit were not under spotlights. The cars that were hit, most of the tires, with the exception of 2 cars, they were walking along and they put their knife to a car that's on the street side, so they had to be in the street walking. So parking your car under a street light does work. It was cars that were parked in dark areas. We talked to each victim to see if there was somebody that, because we had one victim, makes no sense, his car had 4 tires slashed. Everybody else was 2 tires facing the street, and we talked to this gentleman at length, and he had no reason to believe why someone would have targeted him. So it's what we call random violence, and this is random property violence, and there's no rhyme or reason for it. Obviously, we're doing everything we can to try to locate the people. It comes back to something I keep preaching. We need people looking at their windows, and when they see something, to call us. Let us determine. The night of the fire, no calls. I mean, we listened to every message that we had on there. We had the call, it was transferred for the fire, and that was it. And it's frustrating to us, it's frustrating to me, because my officers are back in the neighborhoods riding around, and, obviously they're going to hide behind a car, and if you rode down the street, and let's say they'd done half the tires and they hid behind a car, we wouldn't know it unless the tires had started. It's a slow process before the tires go down. And the ones that were slashed are in dark areas. It'd be hard to even see them going down late at night going through. As I think we all know, it's pretty dark in our side streets at night.
Right.
I just urge the community.
If I can just ask if there was any sense from the department, knowing the history of various complaints, of any particular trouble with calls for Forest Park and for the fence and for any trouble back in the woods back there? Because I know, 10 or 15 years ago, there were a fair number of problems, and then it kind of subsided.
In the last 2 years that I've been here, no. I was caught a little off guard because I did follow up on the information I got this morning, and we haven't had any sale. We've been, last summer we hit the parks pretty hard. We had numerous complaints about some activity in the park. Well, actually 2 years ago when I first got here. Last summer it was rather quiet. We really didn't have one park I got complaints on last summer, and it wasn't that one.
Okay. Thank you.
But I urge.
I have come home one time and had police activity, like dogs sniffing around my backyard because they had chased somebody through that area up into my yard.
Okay.
Right, I was just going to call your attention to the fact that before you started work with the city, there were quite a bit of vandalism and complaints about people cutting through that way, and that was why that city fence was actually installed. And I understand, talking to the gentleman this evening, that I guess there's been other vandalism, but you haven't reported that. Right. Well, evidently they've grown up because this is more serious, so you need to be reporting it, yeah.
Councilmember Klein.
I am aware in the time that I've been on the council, and I'm sorry I don't recall exactly what time point, but there's been discussion on the Woodland listserv in particular about the park and people gaining access to the backyards through the park. And my understanding is, and you referred to it as the common area, but in fact it's all private property. And within the last year, and maybe within the last 6 months, there was an incident of a group that came and they were training dogs. They were training, you remember this? It was some kind of a canine dog training program.
I remember that.
They decided to take them into essentially on other people's private property. And I don't know if one of the neighbors invited them, but all of that area, once you leave the park, is private property and belongs to all of those residents there. That they choose not to put fence up and share it among themselves is one thing. But we talked with the Public Works Director also about how we can make changes to the fence there, because it's maybe more vulnerable than some of the other park areas that we have in the city, and it's a kind of a unique problem. I think in part because of the history of I think it used to be that the people who lived on Woodland, and I guess it's borders Prince George's and Woodlands area, used to be sort of more free about who could go up there. And I think one of the things that happens in a community when that happens is people, they think of it as public property even though it's really not. And we talked about doing a stronger fence and maybe even doing like a wrought iron fence, which I guess I said was relatively expensive compared to the kind of good neighbor fence that the city's been putting in around all the other places, which is, one panel on one side and then on the other, and it kind of goes back and forth. So maybe it's worthwhile to revisit that piece of it as well. And then I think the chain link fence is ugly and they cut through it. But it's also possible, that two fences. If the city has a fence on one side and the people have a fence on the other, it's more burdensome to get through it. We should probably revisit that.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. Is there any other public comment?
Yeah, I don't have very much to add. My name is Janine Anderson, and I live on Prince George's Avenue. And I read through an account that was put out by one of my fellow neighbors on Prince George's Avenue, was forwarded by a friend of mine, about this incident of the fire in the park. And as I understand it, it might have been as many as, I guess some people think it might have been as many as 3 separate fires that were set. But anyway, I was just wondering if we would be able to find out whatever the conclusion is about this eventually. I just was wondering what progress there had been in investigating the fire. I saw a fire truck in the middle of the night. It was early Saturday morning, and I saw the fire truck out there. I noticed some. I woke up and I heard some. I noticed some red lights on the wall. I looked out and I saw this fire truck, and I observed it for a while, and there didn't seem to be any lights on in any of the neighboring houses, and there didn't seem to be really any activity associated with the fire truck. So I assumed that that's what the fire truck was there for, was because of this fire that had broken out in Forest Park. But the fire truck was up kind of in the middle of the street. But anyway, subsequently, after hearing that there were flames shooting up pretty high from the stockade fence, it's worrisome to me that there are possibly young hoodlums out there doing this type of thing in the middle of the night when people are sleeping. And you sort of wonder what else they might like to set fire to. And especially when combined with the recent rash of car vandalism, it's a matter of concern. So I just thought I'd come and see if the topic came up tonight and mention it to you guys. Thanks.
And I believe that one of your neighbors has been in contact with the fire marshal, and maybe more of you, and it sounds like they're sharing information so that if you all talk with your neighbors and there's somebody who's a point of contact with the fire marshal, I'm sure that you can find out what's happening with that investigation.
I spoke to the captain who was on what I think C shift, who took care of the fire, and he called me back today and forwarded my contact information to the fire marshal.
Okay.
So I said, should be in contact.
Good.
I'm on that list.
Okay. Any other public comment? Okay, then the next item is the city manager's comments.
Nothing to report this evening.
Okay. Then we will move along to the consent agenda. We have 4 items on tonight's consent agenda: resolution providing for an appointment to the Ethics Commission, resolution recommending appointment of city representative to the Montgomery County Martin Luther King Commemorative Committee, resolution providing for appointments to the Emergency Preparedness Committee, and a resolution providing for appointment of non-voting members to the Washington Adventist Hospital Land Use Committee. Do I hear a move to, and a second? Well, I guess there were 2 moves. I'll let the clerk sort it out. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. The consent agenda carries. We will now move to agenda item number 3, which is the 2008 annual police report. Welcome. We haven't heard from you in about 2 minutes.
Does each council member do have a copy of our report?
And is this pretty similar to what we received in our packets and so on?
No, this is much more extensive.
Okay.
I want to give you a brief introduction to the report and some highlights, and then I'll open it up for questions. In taking over the police department, I'm coming up on 2 years next month, we're closer to it than 3 weeks actually. But one of my goals was to provide openness, provide information to the community, and continually update the council, the manager, and ensure that communication was going on. Obviously, when you have 24 vandalisms and you're coming in to talk about what you feel is a positive report, it kind of puts a little damper. But when you have openness, you're going to have discussion. And the good thing is, with the openness, we do respond to the community when they have concerns. We were on top of this other incident early this morning, making sure that everything was done right. The vandalisms that occurred Thursday evening at 6:45, I had been notified, and the manager knew about it within 30 minutes of what we were doing and how we were going to follow up. When you put out a report like this, you do open yourself to criticism. People always question, and one of the things we have in Tacoma Park is openness in discussion, and we will continue to have that. But I think the report is a good way of reporting to the community on what we've tried to do over the last 2 years to meet the goals and objectives that you have provided for the manager and provided for me and for the department. What we try to accomplish in this is to report to the community on what is happening and what's happened in the year 2008. And with openness, there will be questions, and we welcome those questions, and we welcome debate on anything we might report on. I think the big highlights, and in preparing this report, because many times you hear police chiefs get in trouble over changing the numbers or how they report things. And we take it very serious in my profession. And in preparing the report, we had at least 3 different people go back and check the numbers, and we actually hand check the numbers against which were in the computer to ensure the numbers are correct. I would tell you that I think the numbers is correct based on report. These are reported events, not events that people talk about. They're events that are reported to the police, and they match up with the numbers that are in your pages, which resulted in the double-digit for Part 1 crimes being down. The highlights to that would be auto theft is down 24%, larceny, believe it or not, is down 22%, and assaults are down 22%. Those numbers are obviously pleasing to us. Robbery is also down, and that's a big crime here in the city. One of the keys that I've learned in preparing this report and looking at some of the stuff that's been provided to me by other neighborhoods, the fear in our community, there's a big fear when you walk from the Metro Center. And we've worked very hard on that fear. And one of the good things we saw in the last part of the year is we didn't have a robbery on someone walking from Metro Monday through Friday during normal business days from August on. August was the last one we had, which is a good thing, and it results in some of the robberies being down. Obviously, we still have robberies occurring, but one of the big areas that we heard a lot from, especially in Ward 1, was robberies and the fear of people walking home at night. And those numbers are down, and we haven't had a robbery in that area. So that's the good news. There's still a fear among our residents. And what I'm trying to show with this report is that, yes, I want you to be aware, but the fear, we're hoping to reduce that fear. And I'm not sure that's something that's going to take longer than maybe one police report a year. Or it takes a community to adapt that things are changing for the better. One of the things that we try to do in the patrol division and with our tactical people is to be visible at night. And some of the numbers I'm going to go into, I think, have played into reducing crime. If you look at the patrol division, we logged in more than 662 more bike hours from the year before. One of the bigger numbers I'm more than pleased with is 2,000 more foot patrol hours. We emphasize that on their shifts to get out of the car and be seen more and be more visible. One of the concerns was the lack of DUI arrests in our city. We increased that by 28%, targeting areas where we know that there's been drunk driving offenses. One of the criticism I heard when I first arrived here is you don't close enough cases, your detectives aren't doing a very good job. Well, our closure rate went up 14%. It's above the national average at 47%. I think it's something we as a council and as a community should be proud of. We increased arrests by our criminal investigation division by 22%. Our tactical enforcement unit seized more than $21,000 in cash last year. That's the largest figure based on figures we keep in the department in the last 22 years. We also seized 2 vehicles. These numbers are a result of a commitment by our officers, by our supervisors, accountability, transparency in how we run the department, and increasing our patrol and being more aggressive and more proactive. Other highlights that we think have added to the department, as you read through it, we now have a crime scene unit. And one of the questions was asked, well, what does this unit do and how does it affect the department? What we've done is we've cross-trained other officers and other civilians so that when we have a major crime incident, we bring them to the crime scene along with our detectives, which frees up our detectives to do more interviews quicker, and they will work the crime scene with one of the investigators. So we're freeing it up, makes us more effective on a crime scene. Our Click It or Ticket campaign this year resulted in 315 tickets and a campaign to continue to get people to use their seatbelts. Our Red Ribbon anti-drinking drug, although we had poor attendance for our adults at night, we had a tremendous effect, I think, on the kids at the assembly, which involved the entire school at Tacoma Park Middle School. We've added one canine dog to our staff. The fear of crime and the fear to walk of the city of Tacoma Park obviously still is a concern of mine, and only by putting out as much information as possible to our community will, I think, we reduce that fear when they see that things are starting to look better. Now, obviously, starting the year with 24 vandalisms wasn't what I planned on, but it's going to happen, and you can't judge an entire year by, obviously, 2 nights' activity. Property crime still remains a big concern, and I appreciate your comments tonight, Councilwoman Clay. Locking your car, not leaving property in the car, is a story we continue to preach. It is important that you take things out of your car. You mentioned about locking your car. I guess being a cop, locking cars and doors is such a natural thing to me, and looking through my house before I go to bed at night, making sure everything's locked. My cars, we need to encourage. It's not the day that when I grew up, and many of you in this room grew up, where we left our cars open and windows down. And unfortunately, it's a changed society. But I think it's going to change. I think it's changing for the better. I think if you look at our numbers, I think it is safer to walk the streets of Metro this year. I think we're more responsive and effective in how we're doing our job. I think we work closer with the community. We're arresting more and closing more cases. And we still need more citizen involvement. We need them to call more and practice safety. In 2 years, much progress has been made, but there's much more work to do, and it's only the beginning. I thank the men and women of the police department, my supervisors, several of my managers are behind me, for responding to a chief that doesn't give up very easy in working forward and is very demanding, as the city manager has learned, and what I expect from my troops. We've come a long ways. We've still got a ways to go, and we will continue to work in that direction, which I believe is the council's goals and objectives. I want to thank Kathy Plevy, who's home tonight, but I'm sure she's watching. She did a heck of a job. We spent a lot of hours putting this report together. We do look for suggestions on how to improve it. It is going to be online starting tomorrow for our citizens to read. I think it's a good report. I think it's the start of something, but we look to improve upon it, and I open myself up for questions.
First, I just want to say thank you to you and your command staff and all the officers in the department and all the civilians in the department. That I think it's fair to say that the council and the residents and the business owners in the city have seen some marked improvements, and we really appreciate all your efforts. Councilmember Snipper.
Yes, I just want to echo that sentiment also. In addition to my personal involvement with the police, the subject of humor,
the famous bicycle
incident. But it's not just you, Chief. It's your whole force. There's a noted improvement in morale and spirit and professionalism and so on in the force, and it's really reflected in comments I hear from the community about their interaction with the police. And I think you had a meeting at my house with a lot of residents that were very upbeat and positive about it, although you certainly, which I appreciate, didn't sugarcoat any of the issues. And I appreciate your pushing the citizens, the residents of the community to take the rather simple crime prevention strategies that you outlined there, and you did a nice job of grading them from pretty cheap to a little more expensive, so people could, decide what they wanted to do and all. And I think it's extremely effective for you to get out into the community, and your other officers too, get out into the community like that, because I think that is, over time, the way that we will reduce the fear that you were talking about earlier, which is an extremely difficult issue to address, because it's, it's not necessarily related to the facts of the matter. It's, a perception thing. Again, I really couldn't be happier. I know this most recent vandalism thing is tough, but I'm really confident that we're on the right path. So, thank you. Thank you.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you. Well, a year ago, when you presented your first report, really, it was impressive, but it was, I think I received it with a little bit of, I wouldn't say doubt, but I was just wondering whether this was just a new reporting or if this was really an indication that things were changing. And I'm confident now, even without your report, after seeing what's going on in the city and hearing from the residents and hearing from the officers and the other employees in the department, that things really have changed. And I thank you for that, and I applaud you and the members of your department, the officers and civilians, for the great work that has been going on and the growth that we've seen in the department. I really impressed with it. I think you deserve a lot of the credit, but also the people that work for you deserve a great deal of credit too.
You're only as good as the people that work for you, and I've got a good group that has responded to some really motivation.
With good leadership, and we thank you for that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Clay.
Thank you for the report and all the detailed information that's coming out. That's really terrific. I just want to say that I see a lot more visibility from the police, and when I first became a council member, people talked all the time about how they didn't see any police in their cars in the neighborhood ever. And of course, people don't call me and say, hey, I see the police all the time now, but they've quit calling me and telling me that they don't see the police. And I, of course, see them all the time, and I see them on bicycles, and I see them in the downtown area. I see them on foot, and that visibility is really great. And I've certainly taken notice of the emails about people chasing down suspects and a lot of the kind of detailed investigative work and arresting people, having cases go all the way through and getting good results on those cases. And I have a very active constituency, and they pay attention to all of that. And they're watching, and I know that they appreciate it also.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wright.
I would also say a huge thank you to you. You talked about the metro issue, and this is something we talked about early in the year, and you listened to constituents and been very responsive and had used a variety of tools to make that area safer, so we're very appreciative of that. And thank you to the officers for all the risk they put themselves at and everything that's happened and the level of professionalism that now exists in the department. And I would just say, as we come upon budget season, would ask for you to think creatively if there's anything else you need from us to make this city as safe as possible.
Oh, don't give them
I
that.
believe you offered that.
Did you see the look on my boss's face?
I want to hear what they are. We can decide whether to do them or not, but I want to hear what the creative ideas are. I do have one question. This because I know you have a lot of connections and contacts within Montgomery County, so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about what we see here in numbers and just broadly how that compares to what's going on in the broader area surrounding us in terms of what's happening with crime.
If you looked at the daily reports, and I share them with the city manager, robbery is up in Montgomery County. The last couple of weeks, I've almost been in shock. The thing you learn when you've got units out in the street, one of the things we got some good feedback. We've concentrated in the Ward 6 on a lot of drug offenses, disorderly, and we got a real good compliment from several criminals who said, we're staying out of Tacoma Park. We know you got a plainclothes unit now, and we're not coming back there anymore. We're going to other places. As I've learned, and one of the things we've learned in talking with Montgomery County, several people that had broken into cars were interviewed, and what they said is, we talk on the street, and the word was two certain areas, one in Bethesda and one in Rockville, was the place to go because the people leave the stuff in the cars and it's an easy hand and you can get away from it. Criminals know. We've increased our patrols, and I like to think the tactical unit, especially down by the metro area during rush hour when we used to get really clobbered, they know they're out there now. We made several robbery arrests, and the word gets on the street. They talk about it in jail. And they know that there are more cops on the street. We're at full strength, and this just shows you what you can do with a department that's at full strength like we've been for the last almost 18 months now. And I think that plays a big part. Our visibility does play a big part. I think we're lucky. People know that because we're in a smaller area, when something goes down, we are there. There's 4 or 5 cars there in minutes. And I think the word has gotten out to the criminal community, because if you looked at things, it's almost like on Piney Branch Road, it stops right at the border. We have at least 6 robberies are right at the border. They could have come up the street. They don't. And I think it is paying off. I mean, we work very closely with the county. And, you know, we obviously monitor Silver Springs Channel every day on what's going on, and they do ours. And we both look out for each other. But it seems to me right now that robbery is up in Montgomery County. I think we've gotten the word out on the street. Our TAC people talk to informants every day, and the word coming back is, we know you're more visible, there's more out there. So I think it's starting to pay off. I think it plays a big part. And when criminals talk, they're just like regular people, but they talk and they go where they think they can get away from something. You make a couple arrests, and they say, we're not going back there. They know better. The county's obviously a bigger spot to operate in, but I think the word is out on the street, talking to people. So I think from the standpoint, I think we are doing much better only in the fact that we are able to concentrate on a smaller area now with more resources than we've ever had before. Our detectives are at full strength. That hadn't happened for years here. Look what happens in 1 year with full-strength detectives. We close 70% more cases. The arrests are up. That's because there's more people doing things. Same thing. You got 4 people working undercover in the city. That makes a big difference in that small area. We cover a big area. So I think why we're doing better than the county right now is only because we're in a better position than they are, and we're in a smaller area. We can concentrate. I mean, vandalisms in the county, yeah, they get on it, but I had a detective who was out on the scene within an hour. That wouldn't happen in a bigger department. So that's the advantage of a municipal department that you should be getting when you've got all the resources working together. Does that answer it? I know I went on a little bit. Councilmember Barry.
Thank you. Chief, I think this value of doing these kinds of reports is self-evident, because I think the perception in the city as well as the county is that crime is way up, and we're in the process of an economically driven crime wave. This suggests that, at least for this geographical area, that's not true. And I should note that the recession officially began in 2007, almost a year ago. And during that period of time, if this were true and the drop in the economy corresponds with the increase in crime, then you'd think the crime would be increasing as well. With the news today that all these jobs were lost across the country, it's clear we haven't hit bottom yet, so it will be challenging. But I think it's important for residents to understand that despite what you read in the newspaper, it's important to take a look at the data. One area, of course, of concern is that the preponderance of crime is taking place in Ward 6, and we have discussed privately that it's going to be a challenge to find funding for the CSAFE program in the year ahead. I wonder, in the absence of a fully staffed CSAFE program going forward, how do you see your resources focusing on this one area of critical importance?
It's still early, but right now it looks like the funding in CSAFE will stay the same. Montgomery County has informed me they've put their money back as we'd requested the last 2 years. Tom Angermy spoke yesterday. It's there again. So obviously, Mary has a meeting Thursday with the state to go over the grant, but every indication so far is
that the same amount of funding will be available. They are changing the emphasis a little bit more from outreach to a little bit more law enforcement, but we were already doing most of the things that they wanted in the crime analyst area. We will probably be doing a little bit more work with the probation department, which is a program I've worked with before, looking at offenders, visiting offenders to ensure that they're following the rules, and then picking up offenders that have been violated. So we'll probably be doing a little bit more in that area this year. But right now, we've got good news on that. So far, so good. And I will obviously continue to update the council on that.
And then Ward 6, generally, what is the plan in place now, and do you see any changes going forward?
Well, when you got a pretty good game plan, you come up with the results we came up with this year, we're going to obviously continue what we're doing, but just strengthen it, and you know, obviously there are new techniques. Things have quieted down a little bit. I mean, we got hit pretty hard at the beginning of the year. We did close the year out on a pretty quiet note, so to speak. I mean, arrests are down in the last 2 months in your ward, and that's a good thing from the standpoint of drug arrests are down, and some of the characters we're seeing, I think we've chased off, and we want to continue. So we're not going to change our game plan. We're committed to stay the course, so to speak, and continue what we're doing and get better at it, and I think we are doing that.
And have you noticed any change in the involvement of citizens in their readiness to report things and call you?
I think that's still a challenge for us in that ward. Diana Dean, our victim assistance coordinator, really works good with our immigrant community and with our Hispanics that live in that area, and she has a good rapport. We have to sometimes work hard to get them to come forward or to continue to cooperate. They're pretty good about reporting originally, that it's a follow-up what we have to do, and we've done a pretty good job there. Actually, I think we've accomplished more this year because we've had some successes that the community can point to, and we've been able to help several families that needed our assistance. So I think it's improving. We got a long ways to go, but I think we're headed in the right direction.
And if I could just ask you to talk a little bit about one thing we haven't talked about, which is gangs. I know that when you first came, you talked fairly frankly with some people at meetings I was at about recognizing that there were some gang influences where I think people before had been a little bit more reluctant to recognize that or to talk about it or acknowledge it. And I wonder where you see things at this point.
We still have several gangs, which we've identified in previous discussions before the council. Sergeant Poole's our gang coordinator who works very closely with Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and the Metropolitan PD. The gangs still reside here. We don't see too much, really haven't seen any gang-related activity. Our gangs tend to not mess up their own turf. They go elsewhere, and we encourage them to take their activities elsewhere at this point. I will tell you we have identified several members of gangs who live in Tacoma Park in activities that have occurred in the county, and the county is very good at keeping that information to us, so we keep an eye out for certain individuals. Gang activity is on the increase. The violence is increased in the county and through the metropolitan area. The good news is we haven't had any of that violence here, but we are well aware of, and we do maintain and to continue to cooperate with the gang units around on what's occurring. There's a lot of interchange that goes on back and forth of intelligence and identities of things that are going to happen. So we do continue. It's still an issue because the gangs still reside here. The good news is most of the gang activity occurs outside the borders of Tacoma Park.
And has there been much tagging?
I think we've had in the last 2 months probably 2 cases that I've known. It really went down this year. The first year we had quite a bit. Especially Terry had reported quite a bit to me, but it seems to have gone down, and the old throw the tennis shoes up over the phone wire. We had one recently, but that was the first time in almost, I think,
Another one now.
Is there?
Yeah.
Okay.
In front of, never mind.
Thank you. Do you have some comments?
Yes, thank you. You know, occasionally people, residents of the city ask, why do we have our own police department? Why don't we just let Montgomery County patrol our area and save taxpayers money? And in past years, I've always had to answer that we can protect our residents better with our own police department. But it was always we can, not that we necessarily did. And now with the work that your department has been doing in the last 2 years and the report that's just coming out now, I think it well documents the fact that the city having its own police department does protect our residents better than if we depended solely on the county police department. Just one last comment, and that is with the budget rapidly approaching for next year, I would be interested to hear your ideas on how we can not focus all of your energy on enforcing our way out of the crime, but what suggestions you might have that the city, whether it be your department or other parts of the budget, what we can do to try and decrease crime without enforcement.
Causes of crime.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Snow.
And one small note, on the front page, under crime statistics for the city, there's this lovely table, and under the first column, homicide,
That's a decrease.
when it goes from 1 to 0, you really, you can't really give it a percentage, so, and
Wait, if you look,
obviously-
to look at a number, I think the year before I came, you had what, 8? We had 4. We had 1 the first year I was here, and the second year we had 0. So and Tom Manger gave us a lot of credit for the 4 when we had him, that 25% of his homicides had occurred in Tacoma Park. So this year he can't give us that credit anymore. So it's actually, it has decreased 100% from where we were, before I got here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And are you going to stay at the table?
I guess I'm next, right?
Yes.
I'm going to have,
And in fact, Councilmember Wright's wish has come true. The chief is coming forward to us with some information that we asked him to come with about a possible expenditure and a tool to use. And if I can just start out with one brief observation, that I would add a little bit to the language that's on the blue sheet for this item, on the back where it talks about the policy, and I would just say that in addition to the council having interest in protecting and promoting the safety of the city residents, business owners, operators, and visitors to Tacoma Park, that we also have an interest in protecting and promoting the civil liberties of those same residents, business owners, operators, and visitors, and that's why we wanted to talk to you about this.
to give you a little background, we have been given an award. We now have to seek bids, and then obviously we'll come back with a purchase. And to answer some of the concerns that have been raised, and I saw everything that was on the listserv also. I've asked Captain Corsi to walk you through what we're looking at. He's doing the purchasing and obtaining the grant on it. And then obviously we're open to questions. I would say, I would ask that you listen carefully. I think it's a valuable tool, and I think some of the concerns, I think we can take care of it tonight with a very open and public discussion. Captain, thank you.
I'll just start with just a brief description of how the technology works. The way that we envision using this equipment would be to mount it into a police car. And in the car there would be several cameras attached to the vehicle that would be constantly reading potential tags, either down and to the right as you drive down the road, or vehicles directly in front of you, what have you. And the scan that this the computer generates on this creates a list of the tags that it's looking at. And it will compare those tags to a list of tags that the officer has downloaded, perhaps at the beginning of their shift, or in fact now they can download it periodically throughout the day. So the comparison of this data is being done internally in the device. The scan that's generated of the tags that the officer views goes nowhere but in the device itself. The data that's used to create the comparison list comes from a variety of sources, and those sources are fully up to the department as to what databases it wishes to draw the potential vehicles from. The obvious one that you probably would expect that we would be looking at would be stolen cars, for instance, and that's a national database maintained by the FBI. So the scan data that's created by the device need not go any further than the device itself to create that comparison for the vehicles of interest. That's one level of use of the device. Now, the scan information is a useful investigative tool, and it can be housed either in that device or in an associated workstation for future examination should an investigator want to look at past scan information to see if perhaps a vehicle was in a neighborhood, say, 2 weeks prior. That is possible with the equipment, but it's not required for the initial operation of the scans. The third level that information could be taken, and again, these are policy decisions and not required for the operation of the equipment, would be to share that data with another agency or other agencies. And there are agencies in the area that intend to do that with their equipment. Again, that's not a necessary use of the equipment. There's no expectation in the grant funding that data gathered by the scans will be used with or shared with other agencies. Kind of some of the information that some of the vendors of the technology describe to address the privacy concerns are that the device really doesn't do anything other than what an officer could do already in their general observation. It just does it much quicker because the computer is much quicker than the officer's observations, and the officer's actually typing in a tag and comparing it to a database. And it does it more objectively. There's no subjective criteria for what the machine scans. It scans pretty much everything it sees. Again, decision to store or retain the scans is a policy decision. It can be set to not retain the scans at all, or what most agencies do is they retain it for a short period of time. Of course, the scans generate a fairly large computer image, and you would have to have a robust storage feature to keep a lot of the scans. But many departments keep their scans for about 30 days. The selected databases can also be customized by the department. Obviously, we want to use NCIC data. That would be stolen autos, missing persons, wanted persons that have a vehicle associated with them, Amber Alert information. That's the most logical things for us to scan. You can also gather information from motor vehicle administrations as far as suspended drivers. You could scan for suspended drivers. But the device itself does not provide any information to the officer about who owns a particular car, or doesn't store any information about ownership or who the driver of the car is. So basically, that's how the device works, and the various options to us as far as what policies we would craft on that. And obviously, we've talked about having a very thorough directive on this device should we be able to acquire it.
If I can just clarify to make sure I understand on I think it was basically your first point, that what the device does is it records a match when it scans a plate that matches a plate that's already been entered into the unit as being in a database that you're looking for.
It'd be a hit.
So that other license plates which aren't a hit, therefore, are not retained in the device? Or is what is retained the whole file of all the plates?
They will be retained. They're created in the scan file.
So the scan file is everything that's scanned?
Yes. But the scan file doesn't have to be kept. Actually, the device actually triggers an alarm when it has a match, and it does this so rapidly that it's done in real time. In a scenario, for instance, where an officer sitting still in a parking lot close to an intersection and scanning traffic as it passed by, it would give him an alarm quick enough on a match that he would be able to take immediate action as far as stopping the vehicle. And it will also tell him what the database was that originated that vehicle of interest. So it would tell him there'd be an alarm, and it would tell him, for instance, it's a potential stolen vehicle.
So that he or she might then pull out and stop the car and
Yes.
then have to kind of investigate and pull up more information from the database to find out why, and it would...
Correct. The officer would then verify the match by going into the appropriate database. And these are activities that officers do many times during their shift as law enforcement exists now, but this would be doing it, of course, at super speed and super efficiency.
In other words, let's say we rode through, you all had your cars parked tonight. It would ride through and scan your tags, and we know no one's wanted, so we wouldn't get a hit. All you would have is your tag.
You mean police in the police sense?
Your tag would be in the computer, but that's as far as it is. We wouldn't even know it's there because it scans so many cars. The only ones that we would know about are the ones where we get the hit, and then we follow up to confirm what the hit's for. So there's nobody, we wouldn't know we had your tag unless you had done something wrong. Where this really becomes really good is when you, let's say you have a crime and you're trying to find a car, we can now ride through a parking lot, and what used to take us several hours writing down all the tag numbers and getting the list, if we're able to run all the tags, if we're looking for a certain tag that would be the suspect car, we'd have it done within minutes. I mean, that's how efficient it is. So it improves our efficiency. It allows us to solve crimes a lot faster.
But you could also be sitting on Carroll Avenue, cars are driving by, and it'll say Bing, stolen car, officer can pull out and stop that car and investigate.
Yes, and it's rapid enough to make that a realistic possibility. We have officers now with the mobile computers who will do that, but they're limited, of course, by how quickly they can send something into the database and get a return on it. The advantage here is you're not, the system's not actually querying these databases. It's doing a quick match against a download from that database that has occurred earlier. So in computer language, it can do that much quicker than by querying the whole database.
And could you talk a little bit about why you might want to retain the data of all matched, of all the scans for 30 or 60 days? Like what from a police purpose, could you gain from that?
An example of that, I guess an extreme example of that was, if you remember the Son of Sam murders in New York, that case was solved by a task force of detectives hand searching through parking enforcement data to get a match to a suspect vehicle in a neighborhood where one of the homicides had occurred. So this was something that was done through an extremely extensive labor effort to get that kind of information. This information would exist, it would sit in a computer for however long, whatever the policy would be, and an investigator could come back and put a query back into the system for a certain tag and see if it had been in an area of a crime. So you're talking about kind of taking an investigative lead and working backwards to determine whether that particular vehicle might have been in the vicinity of the crime on an earlier date. And that's dependent on how long the policy would be for the retention or the physical limitations of how much data could be stored in whatever device we obtain.
Okay, Josh, let me give you a good example. We'll probably be giving this to our tactical people who sit and run tag numbers, always looking when they see a car that looks suspicious. Lots of times we run a tag number or a car, it's nothing, let's say on Tuesday. Maybe by Friday a robbery's occurred and he'll remember, I ran a car similar to that. It gives us the capability of going back and looking in that database to see if that vehicle was there and where was it. So that's another way of using it, how we would use it here in Tacoma Park. And you'd only go back if you had a reason to look at that number. I mean, we could have hundreds of tag numbers unless there's a reason to look at that number with probable cause. The number's safe in the computer and then would be deleted at a certain period, whatever we decide on the policy.
And then could you talk about why other agencies might want that? You mentioned that some other agencies might want you to share that information with them.
Just like crimes don't stop at the border one way or the other, a detective in Silver Spring, for instance, might want to know what cars might have been in the vicinity of
Carroll and
Flower and Piney Branch on such and such night, and they could either if they could directly access the information, they would search it themselves, or they could contact an investigator in Tacoma Park to search it if we were not sharing that information.
And is the county planning to, or are they using a similar?
Well, with larger agencies, of course, they want to have an ability to house the information in a central location, and the county has a number of these tag readers and will be housing that information in their records management system. That's an option for us, not necessarily a requirement, but an option. And they would, of course, be interested in the different municipalities within the county sharing that information with them.
And do you know, have they set up a policy around how they're going to handle the information?
I don't know whether they've set up a retention policy yet.
Maybe we could look into that, and we could be informed by what that policy might be. And will this grant cover the full cost of the item, or would we have to, is there a match component to it, or how does it work?
In applying for the grant, I selected, we had some information on one particular vendor, and I priced it out on that vendor's costs. Subsequent to submitting the application, I learned that several agencies in the state had already been awarded grant funding for this, and for this type of project. And they had a vendor that they had at a lower bid, I guess. And so the amount approved, the original application was about $34,000. The amount approved was $27,000, which was essentially the best price that Baltimore County was getting for the same technology and the training and the maintenance and support, which was what was included in our original figure. So it's the same. It's enough money to cover the entire cost of the project.
So I guess I would say, I know we're not voting tonight, but I guess I would say I would be okay with moving forward with the understanding that the maximum we're committing to absolutely is kind of the very basic level of what we talked about, which is at that moment scanning, do you get a hit? Yes, you pursue the person, or you're scanning through cars in the parking lot. I want to think about and probably read up more on kind of the retention of the data and think more about how that impacts people's civil liberties before I would commit, from my perspective, on the retention and for how long. But that's fine.
And if I can just a second, just comment on my sense of what other jurisdictions are doing. This question of this technology came up, I don't know, I'll say 4 or 5 months ago at a National Capital Region Emergency Preparedness Council meeting that I was at, and it was for funding that's going to be available under UASI grants. So that my sense was that all area departments are going to be employing this, and I kind of had some questions at the time about some of these same types of issues, and the answer back from a number of the officials in the room there was that this was no real change. It was a slightly different and more efficient technology, but it wasn't anything different than what departments are doing already, and that in fact some of the departments already have this type of equipment, and basically their response to me was, this is nothing new. So I had the sense that it was already becoming embedded in the region.
Well, it's being used by all the other departments.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of interested in what your concerns are, because I have seen the discussions on the listserv, and I'm not sure I understand where the concern's coming from.
I would like to take a crack at that.
Yeah, so Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you. First of all, I think we all agreed a little earlier that we're all good guys in the room here. And so this isn't a concern about any of the individuals involved. But I think this is such a powerful tool in capturing and identifying license plates that we want to make sure that it doesn't create a situation that people who aren't good in the future, we don't want them to be able to abuse the tool. It's just like when you ask for approval of tasers for the officers. The same idea that, in good hands and under good management, they can be used properly and properly controlled. But they can also be abused, and this is a tool also that could be abused. I think we could, at least I could foresee a way that it might be. And so I think it's important for us to just understand not only what the capabilities of the technology are, but also what what the policies are that we're going to have here in Tacoma Park for its use, and make sure that they do cover, keep us safe and safeguard the civil liberties of the residents of Tacoma Park. I looked at the price. How much does one of these police cars cost? This is $27,000 some dollars for a little device you can add into the car.
The actual device itself will be about $24,000, I think. But that is just about the price.
Put this in one of the cars that never gets wrecked, right?
We hope not.
Trust me on that one.
Anyways, I had a couple of questions. You mentioned the Amber Alert. If there's a specific vehicle that's identified, I'm sure that would be a tag number that you would want to put in the system to watch for that as a suspect vehicle. How about people who have been identified as sex offenders? Would those be downloaded into the system during a period of an Amber Alert to monitor them?
I don't know. That's not a use that I heard was possible. But
all right, guys, I have a bunch of questions. Just I'm trying to understand the technology and the planned use of it. You mentioned the use of data from NCIC for stolen automobiles. Is that going to in any way include tag numbers for immigration detainers? It's possible to exclude those, or they're not included in the tag list?
Well, it wouldn't be any different than when we get an NCIC hit now, we just ignore it.
Okay.
So same policies in effect.
All right.
What you have to realize is the tag is going to NCIC, plus there's other databases that are added on. So the same rules apply as if we get a hit from there would apply when we're using the tag reader. Just the tag reader gives you thousands of tags in minutes as opposed to a couple tags when you're,
Right. You mentioned in the earlier write-up that you could use this in an area of interest, such as, you've used a couple examples. I don't want to disparage anyone's ward. But from what I understand from the testimony tonight, it's something that could and probably would be used throughout the city, not just during a time of a high volume of crime in one area, but something you would use
every night,
everywhere, wherever the vehicle was going. Okay, and that it's scanning everybody's vehicle that it happens to see and retaining that. And I think that retention of innocent people's tags for a period of time is where there's the most serious concern of violation of civil liberties, of how that data is could be used or would be used in the future, and how we control the use of that. I don't expect an answer tonight, but I think I'm supportive of, it's like, computers replace telephone operators, and if they hadn't, we wouldn't have enough people in the world to be telephone operators now. It's the same thing. I think this is a great technology. It's going to save people hours, and it's also going to increase the effectiveness of the police. But I think it's going to be important to have the policy come back to the council for approval on such things as, how long do we retain innocent people's tags, and how does that data get used, and should we share it or not share it? I think those are important questions that need to be answered, and I think it's important for the council to be involved in those decisions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful in clarifying a number of issues. I had my little list too, and this was very helpful in clarifying them. There is a concept in the privacy world that's called effectively private, and it's the idea, for example, that my property tax records, before they were computerized, were effectively private because they would require, for you to look at those records, you have to go to the courthouse during the hours they're open and go through piles of paper until you found mine. And the difficulty of doing that for, large numbers of people made it effectively private. Now that they're computerized and on the web, and I can find out, whether my neighbors how much they pay in property taxes and whether they've paid, creates a different dynamic then, because then that sort of effectively private aspect is gone. And this fits this same dilemma. When an individual police officer is sitting at an intersection and cars are going by, the police officer is focusing on all kinds of things. Are people speeding? Are they going through the red light? Are they, driving like they're intoxicated, and so on, in addition to, looking for that list of stolen vehicles kind of thing. It means that there's, in a sense, an effective privacy part, because the officer isn't writing down the list of every single car that goes by. This technology changes that dynamic, and that's why it's worth thinking about this carefully. I think that one thing that helps us in this dilemma is that the large number of tags that are scanned and saved creates a random search concept. And many privacy experts have said when these searches are done randomly, it does present a higher privacy to it, rather than kind of targeted, or because that moves into the kind of profiling dilemmas and similar sorts of things. So I think when we come to look at the actual policy, I do believe we'll be able to come up with a balance between focusing this effort on where we'll get the biggest bang for our effort. Clearly, stolen cars are the most obvious one, and there'll be, I assume, a set of other uses for which this is a great technology, and you're likely to get a lot of bang for your buck, as it were. And then there'll be much farther down, some of the ones we were talking about. There certainly are not a lot of Amber Alerts, certainly compared to the number of stolen cars. So that seems to me to be a pretty unlikely one. And I assume that since other communities have experience with it, you guys will be able to find out what are the kind of most frequent uses that prove effective and productive. I mean, after all, we don't want our officers spending a lot of time with hits that don't really get you very much. There'll always be false hits and similar stuff. So I think we'll be able to craft a policy for this. I think I'm really looking forward to the whole discussion, because I think it will help the community understand the pros and cons of this, see the pros, understand they have, if it's done well, nothing really to worry about. And I definitely appreciate, I want to end on this, I really appreciate the kind of thoughtful presentation you've done for this, because I know both of you, and I know that we'll get the kind of thoughtful proposal when you actually come forward with it. So I'm pretty happy about that part. I remain cautious that we can develop the policy, but I'm pretty confident we'll be able to do that.
Any further questions or comments? Josh?
Just, I think another thing that is of concern is sort of how that data gets shared with who. And you sort of, and I think to Terry's point, like, we're all good guys in the room here, but once it gets to other people, we're less certain about that. And if I said to you 2 years ago, do you think the state police would spend time spying on Catholic nuns and peace activists and environmentalists, you'd say that's the craziest use of public money ever. But that happened in our state, and so who's to say that someone wouldn't take that data and say, oh, these license plates are outside this institution, so let's put these people on a terrorist watch list. It's that kind of things where the data could be misused further up the chain that I think are of concern. And I also think the data that we put in on who we're going to get hits on, I think will be very critical. Like you could decide you wanted to get pinged when a convicted felon went by. Is that something we really should do? Probably not, because they've served their time and they're done. We shouldn't be hassling them in any other way than we would any other citizen. But if a stolen car goes by, bang, yes, we should react on it. So I think, to echo what Ruben was saying, I think I'm optimistic that we can craft something that will be an effective enforcement tool, and I commend both of you for bringing this forward, and this is exactly the kind of interesting use of technology that can help us. We need. We just will need to be careful about it and think through the issues where civil liberties could become an issue. So.
Yes, sir.
I think if I could add one more thing about kind of the difference in how it works compared to how an officer would work today is, again, like I said, the comparison, the scan and the comparison is done internal to the unit. And actually, when an officer currently runs a tag, say, against the NCIC files, a record is made of that. And whether it's a hit or not, that information is accessible later on. That Officer Jones did a query on such and such date, such and such time on this tag. And it's a little cumbersome to get the information, I think kind of what Councilmember Snipper was alluding to, but it can be done. They do these all the time. It's called offline searches. The advantage in this system is it doesn't create that kind of record. It's not actually pinging the database. It's doing the comparison internally, which is a plus.
All right, it sounds like this item will be coming back to us hopefully soon for a fleshing out of the policy. One last question or comment?
I just wanted to
Councilmember
say I support the
Glenn.
efforts, and I'm sure that's a big shock to you. And I'm confident that come up with the policies that we need to ensure people's civil rights. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our final item for the evening is the city manager's quarterly financial report. And if I can just note that I had to leave and go out and swear in 3 ethics commissioners for the Ethics Commission so that they could go into the closed session that the commission had gone into. So.
Go ahead.
Gee, you lost your audience.
A few council members ran after the chief. He did such a great job.
I could probably wrap this up
Swept
before
up
they
with
return.
the rapture of the moment.
I can go through this fairly quickly, actually. As we do throughout the year, we try to present the council with kind of updates on where things stand. Budgetarily, included in your packet is a fairly detailed numerical report, and I'll just hit some of the highlights of the narrative. Kind of starting with the general fund revenues. Obviously, the second quarter of the year is when we get a lot of our property tax revenues in. As of December 31st, compared to the same period last year, our property tax revenues from real property taxes was up by about $629,000. I think this isn't a surprise to the council, as we talked about during the budget process. Even though the property tax rate was actually lowered by the council for this fiscal year, the escalation in the assessed base actually resulted in increased revenue. So I think that's what we're seeing as of December 31st. Some other things just to sort of highlight. Income taxes is something that the finance director and I always spend a great deal of time talking about during the budget process and throughout the fiscal year. In the last fall's legislative session, and this was actually the legislative session in 2007, actually, the General Assembly approved an increase in the personal exemption, which in effect decreases the taxable income on which local income taxes are based. As we do during our budget process, we have some discussions with Montgomery County's chief economist in terms of putting together our income tax projections. We don't exactly track theirs, but there is some correlation that we see with the county's own experience in this revenue source. And based on the change by the General Assembly, we actually projected minimal growth this year in income taxes. What we saw as of the end of the second quarter is revenues were actually up by about $152,000. Whether that continues to hold through the year is something that remains to be seen. This is a revenue source that, quite frankly, particularly in the latter month or two, or even after the close of the fiscal year, when we're sort of getting data that accrues back. Sometimes we've been fortunate enough to get a big check in July that actually goes back to the prior fiscal year, and sometimes we haven't. So it's just kind of a wild card that we continue to watch throughout the year, and particularly towards the end of the fiscal year. Highway user revenues were down as of the end of last year. That wasn't a surprise, as we've talked about on several occasions. We've now gotten 2 revised projections from the state for this revenue source, while we were only down by about 31,000 as of the end of the second quarter. Based on the data we've received from the state, we're actually projecting at this point that will come in about $76,000 under budget. So hopefully we won't get another love letter from SHA telling us that it's going to drop even further, but it won't shock me. One thing I did want to call to the council's attention, which I don't think we talked about last quarter, was revenues from the use of money and property. This is essentially investment income. Last year, as you may recall, we were actually greatly exceeded our budget projection. Some of that was interest rates were up. Finance director, I think, does an excellent job in terms of doing cash management. This year we did project revenues to go down. We were already starting to see sort of some softening of the economy and interest rates starting to fall. I think certainly no one expected what has happened last fall in terms of how sharp a dive the economy took. And so at this point, I think it really is questionable whether or not we'll even hit our budget projections in this source. It's something that we're continuing to track. While we expected a decrease, quite frankly, I think the economic conditions have hit all local governments much harder, and this is probably one of the areas where Tacoma Park is actually experiencing that. So it's something we'll continue to track and certainly keep you advised as the year goes along. That's kind of, I think, some of the highlights in terms of revenues. Expenditures, nothing really, I think, that was surprising. I think the one area that I did just want to call to the council's attention had to do with the police department expenditures. As you'll note in the numerical figures as well as in the commentary, the police department operating expenditures were up compared to last year by about $196,000. Obviously, they're one of the budgets that is heavily dominated by personnel costs. About 98% of their budget is actually made up of personnel costs. Some of this is probably attributable to the fact that we're contributing a higher percentage rate to the police employees pension plan, as you may recall from, I guess, the budget discussions, as well as the valuation that you all received of that pension plan. Because of the disabilities and just sort of market conditions, we're not quite moving along as much as we would have liked in terms of the funding ratio. So at the advice of the actuaries, we did bump up what we are contributing for this year above and beyond what was actuarially required. I will be bringing forward a budget amendment during the month of February. One of the things that the chief and I have talked about is he mid-year did add an additional officer to the TEU squad. It used to be 3 officers, it's now 4. So that accounts for some of the variances you see within the divisions. For example, CID or support services compared to last year was up by about $201,000. If you look at how much of their budget was spent, they went through a big chunk in the first 6 months of the year, and part of that is that 4 TEU officer was actually budgeted in operations, but the costs are actually being charged to CID. So part of what we'll be bringing forward next month is basically a budget amendment to make sure that where people are actually working and being charged basically reflects where the money is in the budget. Chief left, but I think he'll probably appreciate my bringing this to your attention. One of the things that he and I have spent a lot of time talking about over the last probably 30 to 60 days was watching his overtime accounts. Obviously, when we were having some of the robberies that we were experiencing, particularly shortly before the holidays, you may recall, we were getting hit pretty hard. We did think it was appropriate to be running some special details. I know we had some instances earlier in the year when we were having a significant number of commercial robberies, particularly in Ward 6, and felt that we needed to be basically working some overtime details to try to address those issues. What has happened as a result is the chief's overtime accounts, quite frankly, are almost depleted. As of December 31st, we're having some discussions bringing forward the budget amendment is to try to see if there are some areas within the chief's budget that can basically be cut or reduced to accommodate that. We essentially are going to focus on essential training. Any kind of discretionary training will essentially probably not proceed with for the remainder of the fiscal year to try to keep his budget under control. I do want to spend some time before I bring that budget amendment forward, talk to the finance director, and I may be coming back to the council suggesting that you allocate some funding from the unappropriated reserve, basically to give the chief the latitude budgetarily in case we have any crime sprees in the latter half of the fiscal year that he needs to address. The alternative to doing that is, quite honestly, is just not do a budget amendment and just kind of see how it plays out. But I don't think there's any doubt that he's probably going to have to exceed his overtime accounts in the remainder of this fiscal year. So that'll be something I'll be talking to Yvonne about and getting her input on what's the best course of action. The only other thing I guess I just wanted to mention, I'll be happy to take any questions, is I know there's several council members that always have interest in the unappropriated reserve. It was budgeted, as you recall, just about $390,000. We still have not transferred anything from that account yet this fiscal year. The first meeting in March, we will have someone from Slavin Management presenting the results of the compensation and classification study to the council. As you may recall, that since we weren't sure where that study was going to go, one of the things that I had asked the council to do was to make a commitment when you approve the budget that we would allocate money from the unappropriated reserve to fund whatever increases are coming out of that study. The other thing that you all had committed to doing coming out of the unappropriated reserve was the $50,000 for the Piney Branch pool. To date, we've not done anything because I'm still a little unclear, and perhaps the council can help me in terms of who that money is supposed to go to. Is it Montgomery County? Is it Adventist Community Services? At this point, I'm still not sure who we're supposed to be entering into an MOU with and who that money is to be transferred to. So if the council has any insight on that, it'd be appreciated.
My understanding was that the council had agreed to put $50,000 towards the renovation of the pool, and not to put money towards operations of the pool. And Adventist Community Services contract with the counties for operations of the pool. The county itself did the renovation work, so I would guess that the MOU is with Montgomery County itself.
I would agree with that, and I'm tempted to say, wait till I send you a bill. I'm sure that's the attitude they would take if it was the other way around.
We're no longer on the air, are we?
We can stop talking about the subject right now. That was really all I wanted to, I guess, just highlight on the report. Certainly, if there's questions about any of the items that I didn't cover, please let me know.
You anticipated my questions, which were the unappropriated reserve. Any questions? Okay, that's it. Thank you. We're adjourned.
Good.
y que rema, rema. Yo soy el conoero que rema, rema y que rema, rema. Buscando la vacina, que es mi morena. La busco para darle cosita buena. Yo salgo del río sin luz y sin copones al cuello, tirando de playa en playa todas las huellas que dejas tú. Me te listo pura en salsa y por Santa Magdalena. Yo guambo cantel ceniza y no encuentro a mi morena. Yo guambo cantel ceniza y no encuentro a mi morena. Playera, playera, ¿a dónde tú vas? ¿O quién tú te vas? ¿A dónde tú vas? Este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero. Que rema, rema. Yo soy el conoero que rema, rema y que rema, rema. Buscando la vacina, que es mi morena. La busco para darle cosita buena. Yo te he visto en alta mar, las cumacas del buen barco. Seguro que me lleva la mujercita que quiero tonto. Seguro que me lleva la mujercita que quiero tonto. Playera, playera, ¿a dónde tú vas? ¿O quién tú te vas? ¿O te vas a Panamá? Este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero, este pobre canoero. A long time ago, yeah, was great. I've held this job as a traveling salesman. It kept me moving from state to state to state to state. Now I'm standing on the corner of Lafayette, state of Louisiana, wondering where a city boy could go to maybe get a little conversation, drink a little red wine, catch a little bit of the Cajun girls dancing beside the cold. Well, along comes this young girl. She's pretty as a prayer book, sweet as an apple on Christmas Day. I said, good gracious, can this be my love? If that's my prayer book, Lord, let us pray. Well, now I'm standing on the corner of Lafayette, state of Louisiana, wondering what this city boy could do to maybe get a little conversation, drink a little red wine, dance to the music of Clifton Chenier, the king of the fire.